Here's a question. Will U.S. society and its economy be reformed without direct action, militants, and revolution?
Well, one should think through these things carefully. Let's think about a revolution. I mean, if a revolution is going to be at all constructive, not just establish some horrible dictatorship worse than you happened, there's only one way it can come about. That's if a large mass of the population, in fact, a large majority, come to recognize that changes that they want cannot be instituted within the framework of existing institutions. That means that if you're a real dedicated revolutionary, you're a reformist. There's no conflict between reform and revolution. What you want to do is press the institutions as far as possible to yield to just popular demands. And if the population comes to recognize, look, it can't be done anymore, okay, then you can talk about a revolution, but not before. And if you look at people who are really interested in revolutions, like Karl Marx, they press this all the time. In fact, he even believed that in England, country that the freest country of his day, parliamentary system in England, the United States, might be possible to establish a communist revolution without any violence at all, just by pressing forward within the framework of the institutions that they have. Well, maybe so, maybe not, but that's the criterion. So I think, just again endorse what Juan and Amy said, you have to try in every possible way to bring the changes, bring about the changes that we think ought to be made by means that are available. And going back to Occupy, I agree with Amy, it was a tremendous achievement, but there's a gap. The 99% have to participate, and that hasn't been achieved. And that's pretty important. It's good to bring it to public attention, put it on the national agenda, get people to think about it, but that's only the first step. The next step is to engage the 99%, and that's a hard task, just as it has been with every popular movement. And you have to remember, if you look at the history of popular movements, they have had successes. I mean, it was a much freer, juster country than it was not that long ago. But it's always partial successes. Actually, the civil rights movement, which was mentioned a couple of times, is a very interesting example and should be thought about. When you listen to the speeches on Martin Luther King Day, or you read the glowing reports of the civil rights movement, they almost invariably end in 1963 with his great "I Have a Dream" speech. Martin Luther King didn't stop at that point. He went right on. Actually, he moved to the north to try to organize programs, first in Chicago, about the horrible housing situation, and not just for blacks, although there's a race-class correlation, so largely, and that was just beaten back. He kept trying to organize a movement of the poor. In fact, when he was in Memphis, as somebody, I think Amy said, he was assassinated while taking part in a sanitation worker strike, public worker strike. He also gave an "I Have a Dream" speech then, very powerful one, but try to find it. It was the evening he was assassinated. He used his normal biblical rhetoric. He said he felt like Moses standing on a mountain. He could see the promised land of freedom and justice. He was not going to get there, he knew that, but you can get there if you struggle on. And then he was assassinated. He was planning a march on Washington, a Poor People's March, to set up a Poor People's Movement. The march took place right away. It was led by his widow, Coretta King. Started from the motel where he was assassinated in Memphis. It went through the major places of big civil rights struggles in the South, Selma, Birmingham, and so on. It got to Washington. And they set up an Occupy movement. They set up a tent camp in Washington to try to bring to Congress the plea to do something for the poor, which is the suppressed, the poor, working people, and so on. Congress, which is the most liberal Congress in American history, let them stay there for a while, and then sent the police in the middle of the night, smashed up the camp, Resurrection City, and drove them out of town. Well, that part of the civil rights movement, it wouldn't be objective to talk about it. It's the wrong story. What actually happened is that Northern liberals were pretty happy about denouncing racist sheriffs in Alabama. It makes us feel good, but not us, please. If you look at what happened in the North, the racism was deep, remains deep. Efforts to break into it have been beaten down at every point, whether it's busing, desegregation, almost anything you can think of. Not for us. You can vote in the South if you like. And what's happened to the country is pretty shocking. I'm sure you've all looked at the maps after the election, the blue and red maps. The first thing that springs to mind is this is the Civil War. It's almost identical to the Civil War, the Confederacy in the North. The only difference is the names have inverted. What's called the red states now used to be the Democrats. Blue states used to be the Republicans. Now it's switched. And what happened is and there's a reason for that. In the 1960s, the civil rights legislation infuriated. Northern liberals didn't want to hear about it. It's okay down there, but not us. And Richard Nixon came along and recognized that he could build up the Republican Party by what was called the Southern strategy. Just take the racist South and call it Republican and invert it. And a lot of things happened that people should think about, like take busing. Busing was one of the programs that turned the white working class that drove the white working class into the ultra-reactionary parties. And you can see why. So you take a look at the way busing was set up. The programs were organized by liberal judges, Democratic judges, but typically, take Boston where I am, liberal judge, Harvard trustee. He said, we got to set up a busing program which forces Irish kids into the black areas and black kids into the Irish areas, but not into the suburbs, not into the affluent white suburbs. We're out of it. Well, take an Irish, telephone worker or something, worked all his life. He was finally able to get enough money to buy a small home in the Irish section of the city where there's people like him around, and his kids go to the high school. He can cheer for the football team. He's got a life. All of a sudden, some liberal judge out in the suburbs tells him, your kids are going to have to go into the black ghetto, and black kids are going to have to come here. How do you think he reacts? He becomes a racist. He starts voting for Nixon, Reagan, Romney, totally undercutting his own interests. But Northern liberals have a lot to answer for about this. And in fact, this goes way back to the Civil War. If you look at American political history, after the Civil War, there were about 10 years of relative freedom for blacks, African Americans. Then there was a compact. It was the Reconstruction period. Then there was a North-South compact, in which the North basically said, do whatever you like. And what they did was criminalize black life, literally, which reimposed a form of slavery, in many ways worse than the original. A slave owner had to at least care for his property. When you throw people in prison and the state provides them to you as cheap labor, chain gangs, mines, industrial plants, it's fantastic. You don't have to do anything. The state takes care of them. So it's a form of slavery which actually lasted until the Second World War, when labor was needed, free labor was needed. And it's never, and it affected the political system. You look at the political parties that formed after Reconstruction. They were sectional parties. The slogan was, you vote where you shoot. If you were in the Confederacy, you vote Democratic. If you're in the North, you vote Republican. There was some mixture because Catholic workers in the North were Democrats. They were in Tammany-run, establishments. But it's basically the story. And in one way or another, it goes till today. It's one reason we've never had class-based political parties. They're sectional. They're based on racist and other criteria, which are not very pretty. And you get what you saw Wednesday morning in the maps on the newspapers. These are pretty deep problems. And a lot of the people the circles we're part of, are implicated in this. It wasn't just racist Southerners.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're close to the end of our time, and this question intrigues me, so I'm going to end with this one. Terrorists' primary weapon is fear. Fear is used as a reason to increase military spending and to violate civil liberties. However, terrorism can never be completely eliminated. How can this catch-22 situation be changed?
Well, I think we can take long steps to eliminating terror. One very simple step is to stop participating in it. That would... And I'm not joking. People now talk about the war on terror as being declared by George W. Bush in 2001. That's totally false. It was declared by Ronald Reagan as soon as he got into office. The core of American foreign policy, he said, was going to be a struggle against state-directed international terrorism. And then comes all the fancy rhetoric, plague of the modern age, return to barbarism, and so on. And then came 10 years of massive terror by the U.S. That's why it's never talked about. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Central America, well over 1 million in South Africa, where the United States supported, Reagan particularly, supported the apartheid regime as part of the war on terror. He even had to override congressional sanctions by the late 80s to keep supporting them. And the reason was explicit. The African National Congress is, I'm quoting, one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That's Mandela's African National Congress, as you probably know. Mandela himself only got off the terrorist list a couple of years ago. He had to have special dispensation to come to the United States. Middle East, tens of thousands of people killed in the terrorist war. The worst terrorist atrocities there were literally run by the United States. So, for example, the peak of interest in the media in international terrorism was 1985. That's when media editors picked terrorism in the Middle East as the leading story of the year. And it was fair. The worst terrorist act in the Middle East was in Lebanon, a truck bombing, which killed roughly 80 people, women and girls, when they were leaving a mosque. The truck bombing was set up to go, a big truck bomb to go off when people are leaving the mosque, hundreds injured. But that's not part of doesn't enter the story of terrorism for a very simple reason. It was organized by the CIA. They were trying to kill a cleric, quietist cleric, Sheikh Fadlallah, and they missed. They just killed 80 other people. A big fuss a couple weeks ago about a bombing in Lebanon which killed some people. And it's a terrorist act. Didn't come close to this. The next major terrorist act in that year was the Israeli bombing of Tunis on no pretext, just you can kill them. They killed about 70 people, smart bombs, the whole business. The U.S. participated by not informing its Tunisian ally that the bombers were on their way. The U.S. Sixth Fleet pulled back, in fact. They have to fly over the Mediterranean, refuel, course, the U.S. knew it and informed them. The third major terrorist act was what Shimon Peres, the great dove, he was prime minister, called the Iron Fist operations in occupied southern Lebanon. It was illegally occupied in violation of Security Council orders. And there was resistance. So Israel carried out major terrorist operations against what they called terrorist villagers in southern Lebanon. That was the third major terrorist act. None of these enter the discussion for the usual reasons. The reason that it was picked in that year was because there were Palestinian terrorist acts in which one American was killed. Okay, that's a different story. So yes, there's an easy, and you can easily extend this, but a major way to stop terrorism is to stop participating in it. And that goes right to the present. Take, say, the global assassination campaign. If anybody else was doing that, we just call it state terrorism, unimaginable state terrorism. And it elicits terrorism in response. So you bomb a village in, Waziristan and kill a couple dozen people, pretty soon their cousin or uncle wants to come back and kill you. And this is normal. And we have plenty of evidence, and it's all over. I mean, take, say, one of the cases where terrorism was actually ended, not just reduced, but ended, a serious case, a recent case in Northern Ireland. The IRA was a terrorist organization. They were carrying out pretty serious actions. No joke. Practically killed the whole British cabinet once. I was in Northern Ireland in 1993. Went from Dublin to Belfast. It was a war zone. I met a lot of people. I had contacts. One of the people I met was an IRA hitman who was underground. He had just broken out of a British jail, and he was in some place where he was secure. So I was able to meet him there through some civil rights activists. And we talked for a couple hours. I basically asked him one question. What do you think you're doing by killing Protestants and British? His answer was very simple. They killed my cousin. I'm going to kill their brother. They're going to kill my mother. I'm going to kill their children, and that's how it's going to go. Well, a couple of years later, this guy was on the negotiating team. He's now in the government. What happened is, here the United States played a good role, incidentally. Under U.S. pressure, the British finally got it into their heads that the way to deal with the rising cycle of IRA terror was not by more violence, but by paying some attention to the legitimate grievances. And they were there. And as soon as they started doing that, terrorism declined, the negotiations started. I was in Belfast a year ago. And there's tensions, like ethnic tensions in any city, but it's a peaceful city, not a war zone. That's the way you deal with the minor amount of terror that they do, and dealing with the major amount of terror that you do yourself is by stopping it.